Okay, so picture this. You're a hospital, and all of a sudden, boom, your entire system is locked down.
Oh, no.
No access to patient records, no scheduling, nothing.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Total nightmare. It's a ransomware attack, and it's crippling.
Yeah, those are the worst.
Turns out they got in through a seemingly harmless vendor portal,
Oh, wow.
something that was totally overlooked in their cybersecurity planning.
Yeah, you really got to think of everything.
That's why today we're doing a deep dive into the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, specifically the identify function.
Makes sense.
Because knowing what you need to protect is the first line of defense.
Absolutely. It's like building a house.
Okay.
You wouldn't start constructing walls without a solid foundation, right?
Right.
The identify function is that foundation for your cybersecurity.
So help me lay this foundation. What exactly does identify involve?
Sure.
My source material mentions things like asset management and risk assessment.
It's all about getting a clear picture
Yeah.
of your cybersecurity landscape.
Okay.
What are your critical assets? Think patient data for a hospital,
Right.
financial records for a bank, or even intellectual property for a tech company.
Okay. So it's making a list of all the important stuff.
Yeah,
But wouldn't that be a massive list for a big company?
it can be.
How do you even begin to prioritize?
That's where things get interesting. You need to think about the impact if something goes wrong.
Okay.
What would a data breach cost? Not just financially, but in terms of reputation and trust.
Right.
That helps you figure out what needs the most protection.
So it's not just about the asset itself, but its potential impact.
Precisely a seemingly minor system,
Okay.
like that vendor portal in our hospital example,
Uh-huh.
could be a gateway to your crown jewels.
Wow.
It's about understanding those connections and dependencies.
This reminds me of something I read about indirect assets.
Okay.
Things like employee credentials.
Yeah,
Or even relationships with suppliers.
that's a crucial point.
Yeah, who knew those were cybersecurity risks?
Think about it. How many employees use the same password for work and personal accounts?
Oh gosh, I know I've done that before.
What happens if a supplier system gets compromised?
Oh, that's a good point.
These indirect assets can become major vulnerabilities if overlooked.
Okay, so we've identified the assets big and small, direct and indirect.
Right.
What's next in this foundation building process?
So we move on to risk assessment,
Okay.
which is all about figuring out what could go wrong and how likely it is to happen.
All right.
It's where we put on our detective hats and look for potential weak points.
Risk assessment, isn't that just a mountain of paperwork and complicated charts?
It can seem that way, but think of it as building a risk profile.
Okay.
We're looking at things like different types of threats,
Huh.
hackers, disgruntled employees,
Oh, right.
even natural disasters.
Wait, even natural disasters? I hadn't thought about that in terms of cybersecurity.
Absolutely. Imagine a flood wiping out your servers,
Oh, wow.
or a power outage shutting down your security
That's
systems. Risk assessment considers all these possibilities and helps you plan for them.
So it's not just about hackers stealing data.
Not at all. It's about understanding the full spectrum of risks and their potential impact on your organization.
That makes sense, but wouldn't this involve analyzing tons of data and probabilities?
It can.
It sounds incredibly complex.
It can be complex, but there are structured approaches to help.
Okay.
Some organizations use quantitative methods assigning numerical values to risks.
Uh-huh.
Others prefer a qualitative approach, relying on expert judgment and experience.
So there are different ways to assess risk depending on the organization and its needs.
Exactly. It's about finding the method that works best for you,
Right.
considering factors like the size of your organization, the complexity of your systems, and the resources you have available.
This is already so much more than just making a list of computers and software.
It is.
It sounds like you really need to understand the inner workings of the entire organization.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about seeing the big picture and how everything connects.
Wow.
A weak link in one area can create a domino effect, impacting other seemingly unrelated systems.
And this is all part of just the identify function. I'm starting to see why you compared it to laying a foundation.
It's crucial. Without this understanding, you're basically playing cybersecurity roulette,
Oh, no.
hoping for the best, but not really in control.
Okay, so we've got our assets identified and risks assessed.
Right.
Are we done with the identify function then?
Not so fast. Remember how we talked about those indirect assets like employee credentials?
Yeah.
Well, managing those effectively is a huge part of this identify phase, too.
Okay.
It's all about access control. Who has access to what and why?
Oh, that's a good point. I remember reading something about least privilege,
Yeah.
giving people the minimum access they need to do their jobs.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's one of the most effective ways to mitigate risk from compromised credentials.
Okay.
Because even with the best security technology, human error is always a factor.
This reminds me of that time I locked myself out of my own email because I couldn't remember my password.
Oh no.
Maybe I need to apply the principle of least privilege to my own life.
That's actually a great analogy. It highlights how important it is to have clear policies and procedures around access control.
Yeah.
Not just for security, but for operational efficiency too.
So it's not just about locking things down as tightly as possible, but finding the right balance between security and usability.
Absolutely. You need a system that's secure enough to protect your assets,
Yeah.
but also flexible enough to allow people to do their jobs effectively.
Right.
And that requires careful planning and ongoing management.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense, but it also seems like a never-ending job.
Well, you're not wrong about that.
Oh.
The cybersecurity landscape is constantly evolving.
Right.
New threats emerge, technologies change, and organizations grow and adapt.
Right.
That means the identify phase is never truly finished.
Wow.
It's an ongoing process of assessment, adaptation, and refinement.
So it's not like making a list and then forgetting about it.
Not at all. It's a dynamic process that requires constant vigilance.
Okay.
But by taking this structured approach, you're building a strong foundation for your cybersecurity program,
Okay.
one that can adapt and evolve as needed.
This has been incredibly insightful. I'm starting to see how crucial this identify function is.
Yeah,
It's really the cornerstone of everything else in cybersecurity.
you've got it. And that's why we're dedicating this entire deep dive to really unpacking it step by step.
Okay, before we move on to the next part of the identify process, let's pause here for a moment.
Sure.
I want our listeners to really absorb what we've discussed so far.
Go.
Think about your own organization or even your personal digital life.
Right.
What are your most valuable assets? And how are you protecting them?
That's a great question to consider because often we don't realize the true value of something until it's gone.
And that's exactly what we're trying to prevent here.
Exactly. So take a moment to reflect, and when we come back, we'll delve deeper into the identify function, exploring how to analyze potential threats and vulnerabilities.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive into the NIST Cybersecurity Framework's identify function.
We've been laying that foundation,
Right?
by figuring out what assets we need to protect and the risks they face.
Right, and we even touched upon managing access to those assets
Right.
through things like the principle of least privilege.
All essential steps.
Yeah.
Now let's dig a little deeper into understanding those threats and vulnerabilities that might target those assets.
Okay, so we're putting our detective hats back on.
Precisely. Imagine you're securing a fortress.
Okay.
You've identified the valuables within the fortress
Right.
and assessed the potential weaknesses in its walls.
Uh-huh.
Now it's time to analyze who might try to breach those walls and how they might do it.
So who are these potential attackers?
Well, they could be anyone from individual hackers looking for a quick profit
Okay.
to organized crime syndicates
Oh, wow.
seeking large-scale data theft.
That's pretty scary.
It can be. And we can't forget about nation-states engaging in cyber espionage,
Oh, right.
or even disgruntled employees seeking revenge.
Wait, you're telling me that Bob from accounting could be a cybersecurity threat?
It's not about Bob specifically,
Right.
but insider threats are a real concern. Someone with legitimate access, whether intentionally or unintentionally,
Right.
can cause significant damage.
So it's not just about external hackers trying to break in. We need to worry about threats from within as well.
Absolutely. Understanding the motivations and capabilities of different threat actors is crucial
Okay.
for effective cybersecurity.
So we've got our list of potential villains. How do we figure out how they might attack?
That's where vulnerability analysis comes in.
Okay.
It's about identifying weaknesses in our systems that attackers could exploit.
Like a loose brick in our fortress wall.
Exactly. These vulnerabilities could be anything from outdated software with known security flaws
Right.
to misconfigured firewalls, or even weak passwords.
And I bet there are tools and techniques to help find these vulnerabilities, right?
You're right. There's a whole range of vulnerability scanning tools
Okay.
that can automatically scan your systems for known weaknesses.
So it's not just about manually checking every single line of code.
Thankfully, not these tools can save a lot of time and effort,
Right.
but it's important to remember they're not foolproof.
Okay.
Sometimes vulnerabilities are unique to your specific systems or configurations.
So we need a combination of automated tools And human expertise.
Precisely. And let's not forget the importance of penetration testing,
Okay.
where ethical hackers try to break into your systems
Yeah.
to identify vulnerabilities before the bad guys do.
That sounds like a fun job.
It can be. And it's incredibly valuable for uncovering those hard-to-find weaknesses.
Okay, so we've identified assets, assessed risks,
Uh-huh.
and now we're analyzing threats and vulnerabilities.
Right?
What's the next step in this identify phase?
This might sound a bit technical, but it's about understanding your attack surface.
What exactly is an attack surface?
Think of it as the sum of all the points
Okay,
where an attacker could potentially enter your systems.
so every server, every device, every application, even that vendor portal we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The larger and more complex your attack surface,
Right.
the more opportunities there are for attackers to find a way in.
So reducing our attack surface would make us less vulnerable.
Absolutely. And that's where all the work we've done in the identify phase comes together.
Okay.
By knowing our assets, understanding the risks,
Uh-huh.
and analyzing threats and vulnerabilities, we can make informed decisions about how to shrink our attack surface
Okay.
and make ourselves a less appealing target.
So it's like fortifying the most important parts of the fortress.
Right.
And maybe even getting rid of some unnecessary entrances that just create more risk.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the importance of a strategic approach to cybersecurity.
Okay.
We can't protect everything, so we need to prioritize and focus our efforts where they'll have the greatest impact.
This is all starting to feel like a giant puzzle,
Yeah.
where each piece of the identify function fits together to create a complete picture of our cybersecurity landscape.
You're exactly right. It's about connecting the dots and understanding the big picture.
Wow.
And the more pieces we put together, the clearer that picture becomes.
This has been incredibly helpful in understanding the depth and complexity of the identify function.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know. It's amazing how much goes into just this first step of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework.
It's a crucial foundation. And as we move on to the other functions, protect, detect, respond, and recover,
Right.
we'll build upon this foundation to create a robust and resilient cybersecurity posture.
Okay, before we dive into the next phase, let's pause here for a moment.
Sure.
And give our listeners some food for thought.
Absolutely. We've talked about identifying assets and risks,
Right.
analyzing threats and vulnerabilities,
Uh-huh.
and understanding your attack surface.
It's a lot to take in.
But here's the key takeaway. This identify phase is not just a one-time checklist.
Okay.
It's an ongoing process of discovery, assessment, and adaptation.
So it's about constantly learning and evolving.
Precisely. The cybersecurity landscape is constantly changing, so our understanding of it must change as well.
As we move into the next part of this deep dive, I want our listeners to consider this. How well do you truly know your own cybersecurity landscape?
Yeah.
Whether it's your organization or even just your personal devices, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned today
Right.
and consider what steps you can take to strengthen your own cybersecurity posture.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
And the identify function is the first step on that journey.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the NIST Cybersecurity Framework's identify function.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
From identifying those critical assets to analyzing those potential threats and vulnerabilities.
Right, and we've even talked about shrinking that attack surface
Right.
to make ourselves less appealing targets.
All crucial steps in building that solid foundation for cybersecurity.
But I'm curious,
Yeah.
is there anything specific to the world of compliance that we should be thinking about when it comes to identifying assets?
That's a great question you see in a compliance context.
Okay.
You really need to consider what data is subject to specific regulations.
So like if you're a healthcare provider, you need to be extra careful about protecting patient data
Right.
because of HIPAA.
Exactly. HIPAA, GDPR, PCI DSS.
Wow, so many acronyms.
There are all sorts of regulations out there
Yeah.
that dictate how certain types of data must be handled and protected.
So it's not just about identifying the data itself, but also understanding the regulatory context surrounding it.
Precisely. You need to know which laws and regulations apply to your industry
Right.
and ensure you're complying with their requirements.
That makes sense. It's like adding another layer of complexity to the identify process.
It does, but it's essential for avoiding those hefty fines and penalties.
Right.
Not to mention protecting your reputation and maintaining customer trust.
Okay, so let's say we've identified our assets, assessed the risks, analyzed threats and vulnerabilities, understood our attack surface, and taken into account all the relevant compliance requirements.
That's a comprehensive approach to the identify function.
But it feels like we've only just begun our cybersecurity journey. What happens next?
Well, that's where the other functions of the NIST CSF come into play: protect, detect, respond, and recover.
Right. You mentioned those earlier, but how do they all fit together?
Think of it as a continuous cycle.
Okay.
Each function builds upon the previous one,
Okay.
creating a holistic cybersecurity strategy.
So it's like a feedback loop.
Exactly. The protect function focuses on implementing safeguards to shield your assets from those identified threats.
Okay.
This might include things like access controls, encryption, multi-factor authentication,
Right.
and regular security awareness training for employees.
And then detect is all about being vigilant and spotting any suspicious activity that might slip through the tracks.
Right. It's about having the right tools and processes in place to monitor your systems
Okay.
for potential intrusions and quickly identify any security incidents.
So things like intrusion detection systems, security information and event management, SIEM tools,
Right.
and even just encouraging employees to report anything fishy they see.
Precisely. And remember, SIEM tools are like centralized dashboards
Okay.
that aggregate and analyze security logs from various sources, helping you make sense of the vast amounts of data generated by your systems.
That sounds incredibly helpful, especially in today's complex IT environment.
It is. And then we have respond, which is about having a plan in place
Okay.
for when, not if, a security incident occurs.
So it's about knowing how to contain and mitigate the damage, right?
Exactly. This might involve isolating affected systems, restoring data from backups, conducting forensic investigations to understand what happened,
Right.
and even working with law enforcement if necessary.
And finally, recover is about getting back on your feet and learning from the experience.
Right. It's about restoring your systems and data to their pre-incident state as quickly as possible,
Okay.
implementing any necessary changes to prevent similar incidents from happening again, and using the lessons learned to continuously improve your cybersecurity posture.
So it's a never-ending cycle of identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering.
Precisely. And the NIST CSF provides a framework for organizations to navigate this cycle effectively.
This has been a truly eye-opening journey into the world of cybersecurity and the NIST CSF.
It has.
Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
Just this cybersecurity is not a destination. It's a continuous journey. It's about being proactive, adaptable, and always striving to improve.
And it all starts with that solid foundation we've been talking about, the identify function.
Exactly. By understanding your assets, risks, threats, vulnerabilities, and attack surface,
Right.
you equip yourself to make informed decisions and build a robust cybersecurity posture.
Well said. So as we conclude this deep dive, I encourage our listeners to take a moment and reflect on their own cybersecurity journey.
Yes.
What steps can you take today to strengthen your defenses and protect what matters most?
Remember, it's a journey we're all on together, and by sharing knowledge and best practices, we can make the digital world a safer place for everyone.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. We'll see you next time for another insightful exploration of the world of cybersecurity.